Welcome to this RPG in a Box video tutorial. In this video, I want to quickly talk about Bauxite syntax. So for those that are complete beginners to RPG in a Box, first of all, Bauxite is the scripting language which RPG in a Box uses. It's a custom built version of the Godot G script, I think it is, or GD script. And its primary design is to be simpler for beginners to get started with coding. And there's a visual script editor built into RPG in a Box, which you can obviously use if you're a complete beginner, you've never scripted before. Then it has a visual script editor, which makes it obviously easier to build scripts. However, the more you dive into the coding language of RPG in a Box, you're probably going to want to delve deeper into the topic of Bauxite and you're going to want to get a good grasp of how the language works. And that's what this video is going to be all about. It's going to be introducing you to the words and symbols which Bauxite uses, and in many ways the terminology that I use when I'm doing all my video tutorials. So this is a sort of better late than never video. I should have probably done this ages ago. This is almost foundational viewing for anyone who watches my video tutorials, because if you've ever sort of watched my tutorials and you've always wondered what it is I'm writing because you can't really see it on the screen in a video, then hopefully this video will help, because I'm literally going to talk about how you write scripts. Now, I'm not necessarily going to talk in this video about anything specific like how to do a quest or how to make a door or anything like that. This is just about how to write script, how to write in Bauxite. Okay. We're going to talk about the syntax, the symbols, what the symbols mean, when you should use certain symbols, things you should be aware of with Bauxite, things like that. That's what we're going to cover in this video. So it should be pointed out, we're going to be spending all of this video in the script editor and not the visual script editor. We're actually going to be in the text editor section down here, where we're going to actually start dealing with the Bauxite code. Okay, if you've never used the text side of Bauxite before, just be aware that every time you add a node to a visual script, it also gets added down here, so you can read the text code for your visual scripts as you build them out. And it's always a good idea, in my opinion, to always, even if you're a beginner, to just keep an eye down here as you're building your visual scripts, so you can start to learn the way the language is structured when it, what's the text version of this function, for example, and how's it laid out. Because then you'll start to learn the language itself. And as soon as you start to learn the language, your progress with both RPG in a Box, but also your projects, will become a lot more quicker, but also more painless. So with that said, as I say, we're going to be focusing entirely in the text editor for this video, and we're not going to make anything specific. We're not going to make a door, we're not going to make a quest or anything like that. We're just going to literally, this is all theory, this is all just teaching Bauxite syntax. So I should also point out, this is not necessarily aimed at people who are already well versed in Bauxite and RPG in a Box. This video may be beyond those users at this point. However, that being said, there's always sometimes nuggets of information that can be new to some people. So I make it for everyone, but really the intention is for people who are starting out and want to start getting to grips with actual scripting in the code language. So the first thing I want to talk about is the fact that everything you type in RPG in the Bauxite language has a color unique to that thing. So for example, these functions down here, if I click and drag them in, you'll see that the function is in blue. Every function is in a light blue color, okay, and that denotes a function. And it doesn't just have to be the functions that you see down here in this list, but it can be other functions like generating a random number, which is done with the random function. You'll see that that is also a light blue color. Okay, now you'll note a function also has these rounded brackets at the end of the function name. Now we'll go into functions specifically in a bit more detail in a second, but I'm just going to continue for a moment going over all of the colors that you can find in the Visual Script edit in the Bauxite code editor. So light blue is for functions. Logic functions, which are things like your if conditions, while loops, for loops, breaks, returns, etc. These are all in a sort of deep reddish color. So if, then, else, end. Those are all in sort of light red, deep red, sorry. And then your while loops, while, do, end. Obviously, I'm not structuring these properly, but it's just to point out that all of the words that you would use for if conditions, while loops, and for loops, for, in, do, these are all in this deep reddish color. Okay, break is also in red, and return is also in red. And you'll notice as soon as I finish typing the word, it immediately changes to that color. So that's a big clue to clue you in that you've written something that is recognized by Bauxite for a particular purpose. In this case, it's a valid word for a logic function. Okay, if, then, else, end, while, do, end, for, in, do, end, break, return. So you'll find if you ever type the word do, it will go red, even if you didn't mean it to. So if I'm typing a sentence like, how do you do, you know, the do's are going to be in red because they're part of the loop logic syntax. Okay, so just be aware that deep red is the color for logic functions. Then you've got, I don't know what you would call it, global data, I suppose. Global, camera, map, player, party, cursor, self, initiator. Notice how these are all in yellow, and these basically denote variable names. These are types of variables that are always available, no matter what state your game is in. Even if you've not made anything in your game, these are just by default, these are always available, and they're globally persistent things. Like global is just your global project. It's just everything to do with your project. Camera is obviously the camera. That's a, you know, an always available thing. Map will obviously change because it depends what map you're on at the time, but there's always a map, so map is always available. Player is obviously the player character. Party, there's always a party, even if you don't have anyone in it, there's always you by default in the party, so party is always available. Cursor, there's always a cursor to some degree, so cursor is always available. Self and initiator are always available, but they change based on the script context that they're in. So self is always the owner of the script, and initiator is the person who triggered it. The script, I mean, person who triggered the script. Okay. Now, I'm not necessarily going to, in this video, go into huge detail on what these things mean, because those I've covered those in my scripting tutorials. But this is just for the syntax. But just to point out that all of these things that are in yellow are globally persistent, always available things. So those are labeled in yellow. Then we have strings. These are in purple, and they are denoted by speech marks, so open and close double quotes. And then any text within here is in purple, okay, and that's a string. Numbers are in orange, so these are your numbers. And Booleans are the same as logic colouring, so true and false are in that deep reddish colour, where the whiles and do's are the same colour, okay? Because essentially Booleans are almost like logic statements, you know, it's logic, it's true or false, it's, you know, it's classed kind of as the same thing, as an extension of logic. Then you've got arrays and codexes. These are in green. Okay. Now there are other types of things you can type in RPG in a Box that are variants of arrays and codexes, and you'll see these a lot in scripts like entity, item, coordinate, tile, group, color, data. What else is classed as an array? Skill. You get the idea. These are, you'll see these a lot. These are sort of, a widget might be one. I'm not sure. Let's check. Yeah, widget is classed as a codex. And arrays and codexes have these square brackets after the word. Okay. And what goes in these square brackets depends on whether you're creating the array or codex or whether you're referencing it. Okay. Now we'll come back to arrays and codexes in just a second, talking about those specifically. But let's just quickly finish going over the colors. I think there's one more color. Oh yes, properties. So things can have properties, like a widget, for example, could have a property. So like the element, for example, a player could have a property like the model or the name. What else could have a property? The map could have a property like the name. The camera could have a property like the view model. If you're using a first-person view model, that should be camera. Item could have a property like the count, for example. The point is, all of these you'll notice are in a sort of dark orange color, and that's the color of properties. And properties usually have, especially if you're referencing a property like global dot property, because it's a codex at that point, you would have a open and close square bracket in there. Okay. So those are the colors. I believe I've covered all the different types of color you can have in the script editor. So just to put them all on screen again, just so it's clear, functions are in blue. I obviously can't type function. The reason I can't type function is because that's also a logic, because you can create a function by typing function begin. I should have mentioned that as well. Function begin and end. That's how you define and create your own functions. It's a bit sort of beyond the beginner to start messing around with that, but I mention it anyway. But functions like display message are in light blue. Logic functions like if are in red, deep red. Global data is in yellow. Strings are purple. Numbers are light orange. Arrays and codexes are green. Properties are orange. And don't think I've missed anything. And if I have, I've already gone over it. So go back in the video for those I've missed. But I think that's all of the different colors that you can have in Bauxite. So this is just to get you to sort of start to recognize the colors and what they mean, because that could be really helpful. I should also point out, sorry, local variables are another one. They're in white. Okay. Now, the reason I'm bringing such importance to these colors is because another color that you need to be aware of is the color white, but when it doesn't have a dollar next to it. So this text here, for example, and the 4 has gone red because it's for loop. So I'll put by. This text here, by example, is completely in white. Now, what this basically means is that Bauxite actually doesn't recognize this text, which is why it's white. It recognized the 4, which is why it suddenly went crimson, because it knows that as part of a for loop, so that's what it's trying to do in this moment. It's trying to do a for loop, but it's not recognizing what example is, so it can't complete a for loop, but it's trying to, because it's recognized the word for, and therefore it's, you know, made it crimson. So knowing the colors and looking out for white when it doesn't have a $ in front of it is useful, because it can point you to errors that are going to happen in your code where it could be, for example, that you've accidentally got text that's not in a string. So this text should all be purple. Whoops. You know, you can start to see that I didn't mean to put the quotes there. That was a typo. If I get rid of that, that's purple. And then when you do your for loop, why is my for loop purple? Oh, I forgot to end the quotes, right? So obviously loop isn't a command. For do should have been the text. But that's just to highlight, you know, why it's useful to look out for these colors, because if you know that a for loop should be crimson, but it's purple, then it might clue you in that your string is still going. So why is your string still going? Oh, you didn't end it. Why is my text white? Why isn't it purple? It should be in the string. Oh, it's not. You know, so that's why it's useful to just point out the colors and look out for these colors. Obviously, if you're not using the Bauxite editor, you're using a notepad or something, then obviously you're not going to have that luxury. But certainly if you're using this editor, do learn these colors and do make use of them, because they're there to help you. Okay. So now let's start talking about actually typing in Bauxite and how to recognize things. Let's start with these functions. So the first thing I want to point out is, other than the color, notice how there's an underscore in between all of the words that make up a function name. Okay, that's because function names don't support spaces in the function name. Okay, so the spaces that you see here in the UI are replaced in the code by underscores, so that all three words are actually connected together. Because if I was to type those as a function, but without the underscores and space and put spacing in, then only one of those words is recognized as a function, the word member, because that's the one that's connected to the parentheses. And also notice how party, because it's a also recognized global constant data type that we covered earlier, it's gone gold, it's gone yellow, because it assumes the word party on its own must be you referencing the party. But in this case, we're not referencing that kind of party. We want to reference the function add party member. So that's why it's distinctly denoted by underscores connecting the words together. So that's the first thing you need to know, other than the color of functions, is that they are created with underscores in between the words, because there's no spacing in the function names. Okay. Next, we have the parentheses that go at the end of a function name. These open and close brackets here. What are those for? Those are for the fact that most functions in RPG in a Box, not all, but most, support parameters that go within those parentheses, like the example above, where we've got a couple of strings that go within the parentheses. These are known as parameters or arguments. How do you put arguments into brackets? Well, it all depends what the arguments are, what type of data type they are, for example. So in the case of party member, it'd be two strings. So you would do your double quotes, you would do your string, and then if your function supported multiple parameters, like this one does, you would do a comma and then a space. Although there's no spacing in function names, you do kind of need to put spacing in between the parameters, the arguments, because sometimes you'll get compile errors if you don't. Sometimes you can get away with it, sometimes you can't. So it's always just a good rule of thumb to remember that if you're going to do a comma, put a space before you then put the next parameter. So instead of just adding the next string right up against the comma, put a space in between it first. Okay, like that, as you can see in the example above. Okay. Now, something useful that you may want to know is, how do you know how many parameters and what parameters or arguments a function can take. Well, here's something that you may not be aware of. Let me just bring in another function for a minute, or let me type one first. Display message, okay? Now, you may not be aware of this because it's not made a big thing of, but I want to bring it to your attention. If you click on the word display message, you'll see this come up. And this is available if the function you've just clicked on has documentation. First of all, you'll have this question mark icon, which you can click, and it will take you to the page in the documentation of the function you've just clicked on. So we'll click that in a second, and you'll see it takes us to the display message page. But what I want to bring attention to before that is this text here that's just appeared on the Bauxite code panel. It basically tells you, first of all, the function name, how it should be worded, but also it tells you what parameters within the brackets this particular function takes. It takes the message text, and then it takes the speaker. Now, it's not telling you the data type, whether it's a string or a Boolean or anything, but it is at least explaining to you what it's looking for. And in this case, it's telling us it takes two parameters, 1, 2. And the first parameter it wants is the message text, and the second one is the speaker. Now, if I don't put any parameters in, I cannot save this script, even though this is correct. It's gone blue, it's a correct function, but if I apply and save, I get an error. And that's because this particular function requires a minimum of one parameter. It requires the message. Certain functions require specific parameters before they will be accepted, and this is one of them. Display message won't just work on its own. It needs something else, in this case the message, before it will be allowed. So in this case, just adding double quotes would be enough to compile it, because at least that's an empty message. But obviously you'd want to put something relevant to your game in there, like hello player or something like that. Okay. Now, if we go back to this, you'll notice that the other parameter has an asterisk just in the corner by the word speaker. What does the asterisk denote? The asterisk denotes that this particular parameter is an optional one and is not required for this to compile. You notice I can compile that even though I haven't specified a second parameter. That basically means I don't need to go into the display message and do a comma and then add in my entity speaker. I don't need to actually do that for the script to compile. I can do that and it will compile, and in this case that will allow this dialog to be said by a particular entity, but it's not a requirement. If you don't have the entity, the display message will just be a generic world building type text. Okay. Another example of this is, for example, add item to tile. If we bring this in, you'll notice it comes in with a couple of parameters already filled in, but if we click the add item to tile text, we get our explanation for the parameters that it takes. Now you'll notice that the tile and the item ID are the ones that come in pre-filled, but it also has a couple of optional extra ones, count and entity ID. Again, they're not required, but you can use them if you want. So this is telling you what this function should take and what it can take as parameters. How many are the maximum and the order in which they should be put. The tile first, then the item, then how many. And then if you want to, the ID. So we don't have to specify a count because this function will assume if it already knows the ID of the tile and the ID of the item, it will just put one of that item on that tile. But of course, we could add a third comma, or a second comma in this case, and specify number 3, and it will put 3 of that item on that tile. So it's an optional thing we can add to this function, but it's not required. Okay. So that's just worth pointing out that if you want to know what the parameters are these functions can take as you write them, it's up here if you click on the function itself. Don't click on the parameters because they're not going to help. Although if you click on the item by item ID, I've just noticed it tells you what the item is in your item editor, which is quite handy. So if you ever wanted to know, oh, what's this item again? Click on it and it will tell you up here what the item is in your item editor with that ID. So it's a quick way of knowing that. So again, if you weren't aware of that, that can be useful to know. But more specifically, if you click on the blue text here, you'll get the explanation of the function. And as I say, if you click the question mark, it will bring the page up, if there is one, for that function. So you can read a bit more about the function in more detail, get an example of it, and explain it, and more explanation on what the argument parameters are that the function's looking for. The order is important. I should mention that, in the case of this function, for example, you can't put the item and then the tile. It wants the tile and then the item. So you have to follow a particular pattern, a particular order of entry. That's, again, shown to you up here, and you need to follow that. So the last thing we should talk about before we move on with syntax is the semicolon. The semicolon is important. It goes at the end of every function. So as you'll see, as I add functions in from the script, from the list on the left, it's always adding a semicolon at the end. Okay. Now, one thing worth pointing out is that the last function, the last line of code, which is a function, in this case add object, doesn't need to have one in order for the script to save, because it's kind of understood that the last line is the end of the script. But the reason why semicolons are needed on the other lines is because they're how Bauxite knows that you've ended one function and that the next function is separate from the one above. If we didn't have this semicolon, then the script is going to think that add item to tile is continuing on with this add effect, and that's just not going to work, because add effect isn't part of add item to tile. So it's going to error, okay, because it wants a semicolon there. So now, even though I mentioned that you don't need to put a semicolon up on the last line, generally I would avoid thinking about doing that, because that's just potentially teaching bad habits, because you're going to get used to, getting away with not using a semicolon when 9 times out of 10 you do need one. So even though you don't need one, it doesn't hurt to put one on the last line, because it's going to save anyway. So just follow the simple rule that every blue function should have a semicolon at the end. Okay. These logic functions, however, work very differently. When you write an if statement, like if player.name is equal to Bob, then you do not put a semicolon at the end there like that. Okay. If you see any scripts with that, that's usually because you've got an if statement and then you drag a function in. Notice how when I do that, it adds a semicolon to the if line, which it's not going to error, but it shouldn't be there. The semicolons just don't go there. So it's not something you need to necessarily worry about, but they're not supposed to go there. The reason they don't go there is because logic functions are typically understood as being multi-line functions. They span multiple lines. This function doesn't end on this line. It ends further down when you finish putting everything inside your if statement, right? So whatever you have happen in here, like a display message or something, these will end with a semicolon because they're the blue functions. They all have to end on their line with a semicolon. But these are understood as continuing. Even if you have further conditions like else or else if, those will still not have a semicolon. Only the end word has a semicolon on, because that's then understood as ending this whole function. And that's when you then need a semicolon. Okay, and that's the same for while loops. You don't put the semicolon there, you put it at the end of the loop. For loops, you don't put the semicolon there, it goes at the end. Okay, so that's semicolons and why they're so important. Okay, now let's talk about if statements, and specifically what the double equals is all about. So double equals basically means you're checking that something is the case. So if I just finish typing this if statement for a minute, let me explain what this means. So I'm basically asking if player.name equals Bob. So that's basically, in English, that would be saying, is the player name currently Bob? That's basically what we're asking, and that's how you do it in Bauxite. It's if player.name equals Bob, okay? Now, another thing that we could write instead of double equals is I could write exclamation mark equals. So it's a single equals, but with an exclamation mark before it. And the English for that is the player's name not Bob? Okay, that's we're asking the opposite in this case. Is the player's name not Bob? And that's done with exclamation mark equals. So depending on your situation you're setting up, you may want to check if something is, or you may want to specifically check if something isn't. Now, obviously, it should be pointed out that if your if statement is checking for if something is, like this, for example, if the player's name is Bob, if you add an else, that will obviously do the opposite. So depending on how you set up your ifs, you can either specifically check for this and then have an else, which will do the if not. But also if you just want to specifically check for is or isn't, that would be done with a single if and then an end. So this would be checking if the player's name is Bob and do nothing else if it isn't. This would check if it isn't and do nothing if it is. Does that make sense? So it all depends on the needs and the circumstances of what you're trying to do, okay? Now, the other things you should be aware of is if you're dealing with numbers. So, for example, if we had a variable, which is equal to 10, let's say, another type of if check we could do is if variable is less than 10, right? And that's done with the arrow pointing to the left. That basically equals less than. So you're asking, is variable less than 10? If it is, do this. Otherwise, do something else or do nothing, right? Another thing that we could write is the other arrow going the other way, that way. That basically means if it's greater than or bigger than. Okay, so if it's bigger than 10, if it's 11 onwards, that would be a pass for this if check, okay? But there are two others that we could have as well. Less than or equal to, which basically means if it is less than or it is exactly 10, that would still pass. Because less than 10 would be, if it's 10, it wouldn't be, so it wouldn't do anything. But less than or equals would still do it if it was 10, if that makes sense. And then the opposite to that is greater than or equal to 10. Okay, and that's again, arrow pointing to the right with an equals sign. Okay. So those are your mathematical checks, okay? Now, when it comes to setting a variable, that's done with equals, a single equals. So single equals is set something to something, whereas double equals is check something is set to something, okay? So we just fix my typos. So double equals is to set something, whereas double equals is to check that something is set to something. So $variable equals 10 is setting it to 10. And then later on, if $variable is equal to 20, is checking whether it's equal to 20. So you wouldn't, for example, let me just finish this quickly and get rid of these. I'm not sure if this will compile. Okay, it will. But if I change that to equals and try to compile it, it would give me an error because that's trying to check if, well, it's not, you've started an if statement, but then you're also trying to set variable to 20, and Bauxite doesn't work like that, so it gets confused. So you have to put the double equals to let Bauxite know that you are trying to just check that that is 20, not set it to 20. This is the one where you set it to 20. And likewise, if you just typed variable equals 10, that would also error because you can't set a variable while checking it without doing an if statement, right? You have to type if then before you can use double equals, okay? So that's worth pointing out. Now also when you're dealing with mathematical variables, to set them you have a few other options. So we could, for example, do variable equals 6 plus 1. So plus is a symbol you have available to you. You also have minus, obviously, for subtraction. You have /, which is your divide. And you have asterisk, which is your multiply. So this would be 6, basically 6 multiplied by 1. That's what would go in the variable. So if I change that to 2, 6 multiplied by 2, 12 would now be stored in that variable, okay? However, if you also have a couple of other mathematical operators you can use. If we set that to 6, we could also do variable plus equals, and then we could say 2, for example. And that's going to basically add on to what's already in there, 2. So that's going to become 7. It's going to become 8. Because the 6 that's already in there, you're then saying just add 2 to it. So it's a shorthand. Instead of having to say variable equals 6 plus 2 later on, you can just say whatever's already in variable, just add 2 onto it. And that's done by doing plus equals. Why can't I do plus? Plus equals. There you go. Sorry about that. Keyboard malfunction. Okay. But you can also do minus equals, and that will subtract whatever the number is. So subtract 2. You can do divide equals, and that will divide that number by what's in that variable by 2. And then you can do asterisk equals to multiply what's in that variable by 2. Okay. So those are all your mathematical operators. So to go over those again, just quickly, let's just cancel that so I can edit. Get rid of that purple banner. We've got equals to set, whether it's a string or anything like that. You've got plus to add, divide to divide, minus to subtract, asterisk to multiply. You've got asterisk equals to multiply onto something, plus equals to add onto, minus equals to take away from something, and divide equals to divide from something. Okay, those are your symbols for setting things. Okay, and then for checking things, you've got double equals for if it is equal to exactly. If it's not equal to is exclamation mark equals. Less than is arrow to the arrowhead to the right. Arrowhead to the left is less than. Arrowhead to the right is greater than. Arrowhead to the left with an equals is less than or equal to. Greater than or equal to, that way. Okay. So those symbols are, useful to know. So another thing that you should know about if conditions is how to check for multiple things in the same condition. So what you do is you type if, and then you'd have your condition. So let's go back to if the player name is Bob or something like that. Then, okay, but before the then, what you would do is you'd use the word and, or you'd use the word or, and it all depends on what it is, what the situation is. So and would have to be, both of these conditions need to be valid in order for the if condition to pass, and or would be one or the other. Okay, so if I left it at or, then what you would do is you type the other condition you want to check, and you have to type it out in full. So even if you're checking the same thing, so in this case player name, you would still need to retype it, and then you check the other thing that you want to check for. So for example, Justin, and then you'd have then at the end. So this is an if statement that's checking if the player name is Bob or the player name is Justin. Okay, if either of those are the case, then this script will do something. But it's just important to point out that that's how you do multiple conditions in the same if. You have to, and even if it's the same property that you're checking, so in this case name, you still have to type the whole thing out. You can't just do if player name equals Justin or Bob, for example. You can't do that. You have to retype out the condition part. So the bit that's after the if, before the or, that has to go after the or. Yeah? So all of this, copy, all of that has to go after the or. or the and, depending on, as I say, what your needs are. And then obviously you would change that to the other thing you want to check. Okay. Another thing to quickly just point out is that there are some times where you want to store a mathematical process into a variable. We've already talked about doing, 6 plus 1 or something like that. That's obviously one way. You need to have spaces in between those. Obviously, I've introduced that before, but let's say, for example, we've got a string, or let's say we've got this variable here, which equals 1, 2, 3. Okay, that's a number. But let's say, for example, we wanted to convert that number to text so that we can, use it in a string or something like that. Then to do that, we would create another variable. Let's just call it string. And then it would equal, and then you would type your utility function. So this is an example of a utility function. Notice how it looks exactly like one of these functions. It's in blue, and it's just the word and then the open and close parentheses. And then in there, in this case, I would pass in the variable, because that's the number. And that will then convert 1, 2, 3 into essentially that. Okay, you can't just run them on their own. So for example, random, which generates a random number between 1 and 10, let's say, if I compile that, that's not going to work. And that's because it needs, when it creates this random number, it needs to go somewhere. It needs to be stored somewhere. Otherwise it'll just generate it and lose it straight away. So for example, we could store it in a local variable called random. And now if I save, it will work. Okay, because what we're saying is this variable should equal the result of random number 1 to 10. Okay, so just be aware that's how you do that as well. Some of these functions, it's not these ones, although some of these functions do support doing this, but not all of them. I'll quickly point out an example of one that does, but most of these don't. But certainly the utility functions that do things, like process numbers or process strings, they will need a variable or a property. So again, I could put a global property here. Okay, need something for it to go into. Otherwise, it's just going to error, because essentially it just create random number and lose it straight away. So it'd be pointless. Okay, and the reason it's erroring is because this function has a return, which is one of the functions we talked about, and it's trying to return the number that it's created. But if there's nothing to return it to, it errors. And so therefore that's what the global property is for. It's for the thing for it to return it into. So examples of things of game functions, event functions that you can use that with. Add character as an example. So if we could do $entity or NPC equals add character, and then what will happen is it will add the character to the map, but it will also store it, because don't forget, this is a local variable. It will store it in here. Okay, so again, you can lay this out the same way. This is an example of a function that allows for that, but not everyone does. Okay, so your mileage may vary. You may find that if you do this, sometimes that'll work, but then other times, let's try an example. That won't, okay? Because display message doesn't actually return anything. It just does something. It just displays a message, okay? But some functions like add character do actually return the added character, so it can be stored, okay? However, unlike random, which needs to be stored, add character doesn't need to be stored. So that will still work without, okay? Let's quickly talk about while loops. While loops are very similar to if conditions in the sense that you type the word while, and then you have your condition that you want to check. So for example, while player.name is equal Bob. And then instead of then, which is what you would type at the end of an if, at the end of starting an if condition, for a while loop, you type the word do, because this is going to basically do a series of things over and over again. Now, I'm not going to explain while loops and for loops in this video. This is just to introduce how to type these things. I've got videos on those topics if you want to, in my scripting series, if you want to watch the videos specifically on while loops and for loops, to get a good basic understanding of how they work and what they do. But this is how you lay out a while loop. So you have your while, then you have the condition, just like an if condition. You have the thing that's going to make this while loop active. So what's going to happen is this loop is only going to be active while the player's name is Bob in this case. The moment it isn't, so you could change the name somewhere or something, this loop will then stop. Okay. We should talk about arrays quickly. Arrays and codexes. So there's two ways of referencing an array or a codex, and it depends on whether you're creating a codex or an array, or whether you're referencing a codex or an array. So let me just quickly go over the syntax for both. So if you're creating an array, let's say I want to create an array variable, then I would do that most likely as a global property, but I'll just do it as a local variable for now. I'll just call it var. You would say it equals array, and then you would do open and close square brackets. And then what goes in the square brackets is all of the data that you want to go into the array. And the data that goes into an array can be any kind of data. It can be a string, it can be a number, it can be another array, it could be a Boolean, it could be a codex. And you can have multiple types of data. It doesn't just have to be the same type. So for example, we could have a string, hello. We could then have a comma and a number, 123. We could then have a comma and a Boolean. We could then have a comma and then another array with some other things inside that. Again, an array inside an array, you still have to put the open and close square brackets on that array. And then the things that go in that array go within its square brackets, if that makes sense. So that would be a string within the array that's in the main array, right? Array inception. But anyway, so that's how you would create an array and put things into it. And there was something else I wanted to mention before we move on. Oh yes, how arrays are referenced. So when you then want to reference an array, you would say, let's say you wanted to check the third entry, you would do if $var and then 1. So why 1? So when you create an array, it's an indexed set of values going from 0, 1, 2, going upwards to however many things you have in the array. So if I was to add another Boolean, for example, that let's say is false, that would then be the third thing in the array. So if I wanted to get the number, it would be 1. If I wanted to get the Boolean for true, it would be 2 in here. Yeah, so these indexes are what you look up for the relevant data. Now, obviously, the indexes aren't written on the screen. That's what's going on behind the scenes in an array. But, you'd say if var2 is equal to 1, 2, 3, that's how, or no, that's the Boolean, isn't it? If it's equal to true, then, do something, right? That's how you specifically check what's in an array, okay? To create a codex, however, it's a bit different because codexes are similar to arrays. They store multiple bits of data, but with codexes, you name the data. So you have a code word that you can look up certain data with. So we could do, for example, name and then colon, and then our string could be Justin. We could then have a comma and then put age as our next string, colon, space 23. I'm sure that's not his age, but there you go. Comma, and then developer, colon, true, right? That would be your codex. And then to reference it, you would say if $var, open and close the square brackets, but unlike the array where you would then have 0 or 1 or 2 or whatever, you would type in the code word. So name would then return Justin. So I'd say if name is equal to Justin, and that would return true because that's valid for the current codex, right? If I wanted to check the age, then I would say the age. If the age is then equal to 23, or if the developer would then return the Boolean, right? So that's how you both create a codex and array and how you then use the codex and array, okay? A for loop is laid out like this. You have the word for, I'll type that again. You use the word for, and then you have what's called a control variable. Typically for for loops, it would just be a temporary variable. So a temp or something like that, name it whatever you want. Then you have the word in, and then you would type a group. You would type an array, because for loops loop through arrays. So group would be an example of an array, but you could also create a variable or have a global property earlier that is an array. So if I quickly set up an example, so global property my array, for example, just call it whatever you want, and it can equal array hello world. So there's two strings inside this array, and then when we do for $temp, we can say global dot property. Just could type my array, and then just like the while loop, you type do, and then obviously you need your end and your semicolon, and that's how you format a for loop. Okay, and so what this is going to do is it's just going to loop through the things in the array. So in this case, just the two strings, and one by one, it's going to put the first word into that string, and then when this loop's done, whatever you need it to do to that first string, it's then going to grab the next string. In this case, world. So in this case, it's only going to loop through and do two things. But for example, if we just did a print no, let's not do print. Let's do display message quickly. So if we were to just do a display message and then put $temp in there, that basically means while we're looping through this script, we're going to get a display message that first of all says hello. And then when you close that display message, it's going to open the next one that says world. Okay, so that's just an example of a for loop, how to lay it out and kind of what it does. But again, I'll go into more detail in for loops in its own video in my scripting series. But that's essentially how you need to lay out a for loop. It's the word for, then you need a control variable, which basically means it's a temporary variable you're going to put the things that are in this array into one by one as you loop through. Then you have the word in, and then you have the array or a global property that is an array. After the word in, that's the thing you want to loop through. That's the thing that's got the things in it you want to loop through. As I say, it could be a group of map objects, or it could be an array of strings and numbers that you want to just go through. And then because it's a loop, you have the word do, because it's going to do a series of actions while it's going through these things. Another thing you should be aware of with arrays is you can also check contains. So for example, we could have a group, which is a type of array. We could have a group of NPCs, for example, that has like 10 characters inside it. You can then check if group NPCs contains, and then you would say player, or a specific ID, Stumpy, for example. And that would be a valid if condition for checking if a particular group or array contains something. So a more simpler way, just to quickly show it, is if we had an array where we had 1, 2, 3 and 3, 4, 5 and 7, 7, 8, for example, let's just say, you could have an if statement that says if array contains 5, 5, 6, then in that case it wouldn't do anything because it's not in there. But that's how you would check if this array has something specific inside it. Okay. Now you can also do exclamation mark contains, and that will pass if it doesn't contain that particular thing. So that would be a way for you to check if something isn't in a particular group or isn't in a particular array. Okay. So just like the not equal to, not contains is done with an exclamation mark. Okay. So the last thing to talk about is placeholder expression. So placeholder expression, first of all, what is it if you're uninitiated? It basically is a way of putting variable text into a string. So for example, if we had a variable which contained the number 23 and we wanted to put that into a string. So for example, we could say I am 23 years old. Okay, but we don't want the number 23 to be written in this string because that means it will never change. We want the number 23 to potentially be changeable because it's this variable up here. And if we want to change the text, we can just change the variable, and we want the string to change. So that's where placeholder expression comes in. So what you do in this moment, let me just quickly explain it outside the string first. Placeholder expression is done by typing a $, then open and close curly brackets. It's the ones above the square brackets on your keyboard, or at least a standard keyboard anyway, for me, QWERTY keyboard. I obviously can't speak for other keyboards, but you know, the curly brackets. And within those curly brackets goes the variable or property which you want to place inside the string you're writing. So in this case, I would do $variable. So $variable inside $curly brackets. Okay, that's how you do placeholder expression. So in this case, I would do open and close curly brackets, $variable. Now notice how this is still all in purple. That's fine, because the engine will understand automatically that the $ and curly brackets is a request to convert the text that's inside those to what's actually in that variable, rather than actually write, in this case, $variable into the string, right? So you're not going to get somebody saying, I am $variable years old. You're actually going to get someone that says, I'm 23 years old. It's going to convert that, okay? Now, the thing you should be aware of is if your data is inside a global property. Let me just quickly set an example up. Let me do global.property age, which is the same thing. So global property.age equals 23, okay? But we want to use a global property in our placeholder string rather than a local variable. So in this case, I'm going to delete the word local variable, still have the $ and the curly brackets, but within the curly brackets, I'm now going to type global.property, open and close square brackets, and then I'm going to type double quotes, and then I'm going to type age. Notice how the word age is in white, and I mentioned earlier that will create an error. Notice how if I let me just make that a variable for the moment, just so it doesn't error without it. But notice how that's going to error, okay? Now, if that text wasn't there, if I just delete that for a moment, that compiles fine, okay? So why is the name of the global property causing a problem? Let me try and get it back. No, I'm going to have to type it. It's causing a problem because what we've got here, and let me delete the variable bit, we don't need that anymore. The reason this is causing a problem is because the way strings work is they're denoted by an open and a close of speech marks, okay? So when you do one speech mark, this is a beginning of a string, and then the final one is on the other end of the string, right? But what we've got here is our global property also itself uses a string. So we've got a string within a string. Bauxite doesn't like that, because what it's going to do instead is it's going to assume that this opening of the inner string is the closing of this string. And then therefore this closing of the inner string is the opening of a new string. So what you've got is a bit of data in the middle of these two strings, the word age, which Bauxite doesn't know what to do with, and that's why it's white. Okay, so look out for the color white, because it's a big clue. As I say, if it doesn't have a $ in it, then obviously, you know, but you wouldn't put that there anyway. But all I mean is look out for white text that doesn't have a $, because that's going to be a cause of a problem, okay? So how do we use a global property in a placeholder expression without it erroring? For that, you're going to want to use backslash before the inner nested speech marks, okay? And that applies to not just a placeholder expression, that applies to any nested speech marks. For example, let's say you wanted a string where a character says something, but in that quote, there's also a quote. I'm trying to think of an example. if we have a character that says something like Stumpy walked over to me and said, "You are a wonderful person to me," right? This is an example of a string that's not going to work, even though it's not using placeholder expression, but it's not going to work because the "you are a wonderful person" is me trying to put quotes into a string because that's what Stumpy said. So it should be in quotes. Okay. So let me, perhaps this will be good with a practical example. This is probably best shown in game. So I'm going to go into game and show you the end result once I've been able to compile this. But obviously it goes without saying, this is not going to compile. Okay, we've got an error. We need to fix this white text. Okay. Again, this is an example where we need to put backslash before each of the quotes around what Stumpy's quote is. Okay, so if I apply and save that, and that's not going to work, is it? Because it's startup script. So let me copy that for a second, cancel that. Let me replace this very quickly with a load map. I'll probably cut this anyway. Go into game. So here I am in game. So if I bring the console down and I paste this display message in, you'll see that the end result is that Stumpy walked over to me and said, in quotes, "You are a wonderful person" to me. So that's what I was trying to achieve. That was my, ultimate aim, but I couldn't do it by just typing that into the script editor because the inner quotes caused a problem. So going back to the syntax script, which I don't actually think I created and I was supposed to create instead of using the startup script. But going back to the syntax script, so if world, for example, was supposed to be in quotes itself, then those inner quotes need to have a backslash in front of them. And the backslash basically means that these quotes are going to be ignored as being quotes. Okay, so notice how those aren't going purple, but these ones are. Okay, that's because the backslash stops them from being actual quotes, i.e. treated as string quotes. Okay, so I think that brings us to the end of all the things I wanted to cover syntax-wise. So the last thing to just quickly talk about is the documentation. A couple of pages worth checking out are the script syntax page. This is going to go over all of the things I've discussed in this video, the operators, the if statements, while loops, data types, codexes and things. Also worth pointing out is the script reference page. This goes over all the global, map, all the gold text basically and what they are, camera, party, system. I forgot system, that's another one. System would be a yellow colored data type, something that's always available. Then you've got your codexes, you've got your utility functions like random number, string, range, round a number up, that kind of thing. And then you've got your event functions. These are all the ones that would be in blue. You'd end all of these with a semicolon, So those pages are particularly worth checking out. And also, if there's anything missing in the documentation, I should also mention, please do check on the Discord, check the changelogs channel, because in there will be a Google Doc page. If you go to that Google document, you can do a word search, Control F, and look up any functions that you're trying to understand how it works, because chances are if it's not in the documentation in the engine, it will definitely be in the changelogs, because most, if not all things, are referenced in the changelogs, because as they're added, brief notes are written about them. So do check that channel as well. So that brings us to the end of this video. I know it's sort of just been kind of boring stuff, just talking about bauxite and how it's laid out. But hopefully it's been useful and good foundational knowledge to start getting to grips with how to actually start writing code and recognizing when code is worded correctly and when it's not, where semicolons go, why they're so important, how to recognize the colors between different functions, how to know what goes in arrays and how to reference arrays and check arrays, how to set things, how to check things. Hopefully this has been useful in that respect and what all the symbols mean. So with that said, if there's any questions, obviously do feel free as always to reach out on the Discord. But that will wrap up this video. Thanks for watching. Stay tuned for the next tutorial.